She was never just my stepmom, but after that night, when she whispered, "You look at me differently now," I realized she wasn't wrong. I've always known her as my stepmom. Not in the strict or distant sense, but in the quiet, graceful way she carried herself in our home. She was never loud, never demanding attention. Instead, she had this gentle presence that filled the spaces without ever crowding them. Since my father passed away 2 years ago, it's just been the two of us under this roof. At first, the house felt too large, every room echoing with the absence of his voice. Dinners were especially heavy, the scrape of cutlery against porcelain, the hum of the refrigerator, and the silence that stretched far too long between us. She would smile at me across the table, soft and polite, but there was something behind her eyes, a weight she carried with quiet dignity. I tried to mirror that composure, though inside, I felt both protective of her and strangely cautious, as if any wrong word might make her retreat further into herself. That evening, I remember standing at the sink, rinsing our plates. She stepped beside me, taking the dish towel from its hook. Her arm brushed lightly against mine, a fleeting touch, nothing intentional, but it jolted me with awareness. Her skin was warm, delicate, and for a brief moment, I caught the faint scent of her perfume, like jasmine lingering after summer rain. I froze for half a second, then quickly looked away, pretending to concentrate on the water circling down the drain. She didn't notice, or maybe she pretended not to. Either way, the air between us shifted, just enough for me to feel it. Later, as I dried my hands, I caught myself studying her profile. The faint lines around her eyes, the graceful way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. There was a quiet strength in her, the kind people often overlook because it isn't loud or boastful. But I noticed it, maybe more than I should. She glanced up and caught me looking. For a heartbeat, our eyes held. Her lips curved into the gentlest smile, one that seemed both tired and reassuring. I quickly looked down, embarrassed by the intensity of my own gaze, and she went back to folding the towel as if nothing had happened. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the small moment at the sink. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't anything that could be called romantic or forbidden. It was just human. Two people who had been orbiting around each other in silence, brushing closer without meaning to. And yet, it stirred something in me, an awareness, a question I didn't know how to ask. Maybe she felt it too, maybe not. But from that evening on, I realized the distance between us wasn't just grief. It was something else, something unspoken, waiting quietly in the air. The next real shift between us didn't happen in the kitchen or during another quiet dinner. It happened outside, in the garden she kept behind the house. I hadn't really paid attention to it before. My dad used to tease her about how much time she spent there, pruning roses, planting new herbs, kneeling in the soil until dusk. But now I understood. It wasn't just a garden, it was her refuge. A place where she could lose herself, where the world slowed down enough for her to breathe. That afternoon, I stepped outside and found her crouched by the flower beds. The sun was lowering, spilling gold across the leaves. She wore an old button-up shirt rolled at the sleeves, a smear of soil across her cheek. Strands of her hair had slipped loose from her bun, catching the light like threads of copper. I almost turned back, afraid of intruding on her peace, but she looked up and smiled. "Come here," she said softly, brushing her gloved hands together. "I could use some help." So I knelt beside her. She showed me how to loosen the roots of a small lavender plant before setting it into the earth. Her hands moved with such practiced care, gentle yet sure. Mine were clumsy in comparison, but she laughed quietly, not in mockery, but in that warm, forgiving way she had. We worked in silence for a while. The soil was cool under my fingers, the air sweet with the mingling scents of lavender and damp grass. Every so often, our arms brushed as we leaned toward the same spot. Each time it happened, I felt the slightest jolt, like a spark hidden beneath the ordinary. Eventually, the silence broke. She spoke about books she'd been reading, little details of her day. I listened, surprised by how much I enjoyed simply hearing her voice fill the space between us. Then, almost without warning, her words shifted. It's funny, she murmured, pressing the soil gently around the roots. How quiet the house feels now. Your father, he always filled it with noise. Even when he wasn't talking, he was humming or pacing or making plans. And now. She stopped, her hands stilling on the earth. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the crack beneath it. A crack that had nothing to do with the garden. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat felt tight. Instead, I looked at her, really looked. She wasn't just a woman who had stood by my father's side. She was someone carrying loneliness, someone who rarely let it show. She caught me watching, and for a moment I thought she might retreat into herself again. But instead, she exhaled slowly and gave a small, wistful smile. I'm sorry, she said, shaking her head. I don't usually say things like that out loud. I shook my head quickly. No, don't be sorry. My voice came out lower than I expected. I'm glad you did. Her eyes softened then, a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. And as we turned back to the soil, working side by side, I realized something had shifted again, this time deeper, quieter, but unmistakable. That evening, the rain came suddenly, drumming against the windows with a kind of urgent rhythm. I had been in my room, reading, when I noticed the sound, then saw her sitting on the couch in the living room, a blanket loosely draped over her shoulders. The muted glow of the lamp cast a warm pool of light around her, and for some reason, the sight made the house feel less empty. I joined her reluctantly, carrying my own blanket. At first, we didn't speak. The sound of rain filled the quiet spaces between us, punctuated by the occasional thunderclap that made her flinch ever so slightly. I watched her from across the couch, the subtle way she hugged the blanket tighter, the soft rise and fall of her chest as she exhaled. When the next clap of thunder came, she startled more noticeably, and without thinking, she leaned a little closer. Our shoulders touched. Just for a moment, but it was enough. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, faintly mingling with the soft fabric of the blanket. My own heart reacted, a sudden, sharp awareness of her presence that made the room feel smaller and more intimate than it had ever felt before. She laughed softly at herself, a quiet sound that seemed to blend perfectly with the rain. I'm so jumpy today, she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her fingers trembled just slightly, and my impulse to reach out was strong, though I stopped myself. Instead, I simply shifted closer, letting the blanket cover a little more of both of us. She didn't pull away. For the first time, I noticed the subtle details I'd somehow overlooked, the faint curve of her lips, the gentle line of her jaw, the way her eyes seemed to carry both fatigue and quiet amusement simultaneously. It wasn't anything overtly romantic, not yet, but the closeness made the silence between us feel charged. The air seemed to hum with something unspoken, something neither of us had dared to define. We didn't talk much, only murmuring occasional comments about the rain or the shadows the trees cast against the windows. Yet every glance lingered a fraction longer than it should have, every brush of an arm carried weight, every shared silence felt deliberate. At one point, she rested her head just barely on my shoulder, almost as if by accident. I felt the gentle pressure, the warmth of her hair brushing against my arm, and a sense of protectiveness and tenderness stirred inside me. It was confusing, exhilarating, and grounding all at once. I didn't move, not wanting to break the moment, not wanting to overstep, yet acutely aware of how close we had come without intending to. By the time the rain slowed, the room felt different. Our relationship, quiet and reserved for so long, had shifted imperceptibly. Something had opened between us, a door left ajar, inviting, fragile, and full of possibility. I knew then that whatever had begun wasn't a fleeting feeling. It was subtle, slow, and dangerous in its quiet intensity. And somehow, I found myself wanting it to last. It was late, long after the lights in my room had dimmed, when I wandered into the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, a sound that had always felt oddly comforting. That's when I saw her, sitting alone at the dining table, a cup of tea untouched before her. The dim light from the overhead fixture softened the edges of her face, highlighting the faint traces of worry around her eyes. She didn't notice me at first, or perhaps she chose not to. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if I should leave or speak. But something about the way she sat, shoulders slightly hunched, hands wrapped loosely around the mug, drew me in. There was a vulnerability there I had never seen before. "Can't sleep?" I asked softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up slowly, a small, almost shy smile brushing her lips. "I suppose not," she murmured. Her voice was quiet, laced with a softness that made the kitchen feel smaller, warmer. "Sometimes I just sit here and think." I moved closer and took a chair across from her, careful to keep some distance. There was no rush, no pressure to fill the silence. She sighed and began speaking, hesitantly at first. I've been afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of being alone. Afraid that people see me differently now, older, quieter, invisible in some ways." Her words struck me harder than I expected. She wasn't asking for comfort. She was sharing something deeply human, something she had kept tucked away behind composure and smiles. I felt a pull in my chest, a protective, tender urge to reach across the table and let her know she wasn't invisible to me. Without thinking, I did. My hand hovered for a moment before resting lightly over hers. She didn't flinch. Instead, her fingers twined subtly with mine, a tentative gesture, a silent acknowledgement that she trusted me with this unguarded side of herself. The warmth of her skin was gentle, grounding, and I felt the weight of her vulnerability settle in the space between us. We didn't speak for a while. The air seemed to stretch and contract with the rhythm of our breathing. Every small movement, every glance, every quiet exhale became loaded with meaning. Her eyes, usually so composed, shimmered faintly in the lamplight, reflecting both relief and hesitation. "I don't usually tell anyone," she whispered, as if afraid the walls themselves might hear. "But I feel safe with you." I squeezed her hand lightly, not knowing exactly what to say. Words felt inadequate, but my presence, my willingness to simply sit with her, to share that quiet space, seemed to matter more. She gave a small nod, a mixture of gratitude and unspoken relief. And in that stillness, something shifted. The careful boundaries we had maintained began to blur, replaced by an intimacy neither of us had named but both now recognized. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't anything that could be defined with labels. It was just connection. Human, real, and achingly delicate. That night, as I left the kitchen, I realized that the distance between us was shrinking. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she had allowed me closer, not just physically, but emotionally. And I knew, with a quiet certainty, that things would never feel the same again. A few days after that late-night kitchen conversation, something shifted between us, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. We were sitting in the living room together, a quiet evening stretching before us. I was reading a book, but I could feel her presence more acutely than ever. She was on the couch, leaning slightly toward the window, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the armrest. The light from the lamp caught her hair, highlighting strands of copper and gold that seemed to glow in the dim room. I found myself watching her more than I should have, aware of the way her shoulders relaxed when she thought no one was looking, the curve of her lips as she read something on her phone, the soft rhythm of her breathing. And then I realized, I was looking at her differently now. Not in a casual or fleeting way, but with a quiet intensity that made my chest tighten. It startled me, and for the first time, I wondered if she noticed. She did. I could feel it before she spoke. The way her eyes lifted, soft and measured, catching mine. There was a pause, long, deliberate, and then she said, almost in a whisper, "You look at me differently now." The words hung in the air like a gentle weight, delicate but heavy all at once. I swallowed, my mouth dry, unsure how to respond. The truth was, I didn't need to speak. My silence already spoke louder than any words could. Her lips curved in a faint, tentative smile, a mixture of amusement and vulnerability. "I can see it," she continued softly. I don't know if it's wrong, but I can see it. I shifted slightly closer, careful not to overstep, letting the blanket draped across my legs brush against hers. My heart was racing, but my hand remained still, resting lightly on my own lap. There was a tension in the room, unspoken yet palpable, a dance of awareness and restraint. She leaned back against the couch, tilting her head slightly, her gaze never leaving mine. There was no accusation in her eyes, only recognition of the bond forming between us, of the unspoken longing we were both beginning to acknowledge. Her voice, low and intimate, held a note of curiosity, of testing boundaries without words. It's strange, she said finally, her fingers brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. How close we've gotten, without even meaning to. I nodded, feeling the truth of it resonate deep within me. I didn't mean to, I murmured, my voice barely audible over the soft hum of the room. But I can't deny it either. She exhaled, a soft, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to carry relief, hesitation, and warmth all at once. Our shoulders brushed again, light and fleeting, yet it was enough to make me aware of every inch between us. That moment, brief and delicate, was a tipping point, the point where everything unspoken between us became almost tangible. For the first time, I realized that our relationship had evolved from quiet companionship into something more complex, more profound. Something neither of us had named, but both of us could feel. And in that room, with the soft lamplight casting shadows around her face, I knew that the story between us was only beginning. The days after her words, "You look at me differently now," were charged with a subtle tension I couldn't quite name. We went about our routines as usual, yet everything felt heavier, closer, more deliberate. Every glance lingered a fraction longer. Every brush of her hand against mine, whether reaching for a dish, folding laundry, or passing something across the counter, carried a quiet electricity I could feel in my chest. It was a Saturday afternoon when it happened. I was sitting at the couch, scrolling through my phone, when she came in carrying a cup of tea for herself, and silently, one for me. She settled beside me, just close enough that the warmth of her arm brushed mine. We didn't speak for a moment. The room was filled with sunlight streaming through the window, dust motes floating lazily in the air, and the quiet rhythm of our shared breathing. Without thinking, she reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from my forehead. Her fingers lingered, soft and deliberate, tracing the line of my hair with a gentleness that made my skin tingle. I caught my breath, acutely aware of her touch, aware of how close we had become without either of us crossing a line. I leaned slightly toward her, instinctively, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand rest against my cheek, just for a moment longer than necessary. Her touch was light, yet it carried weight, reassurance, curiosity, and something tenderly unspoken. I could feel the warmth of her palm, the subtle pressure, the steadiness in her movement. The moment stretched, quiet but electric, as if the world outside had paused to let us feel it fully. We sat like that for a while, neither speaking, only existing in the shared space, the intimacy growing with every heartbeat. Her eyes, soft and searching, met mine, and I saw a flicker of vulnerability mixed with quiet strength. It was as if she was testing the waters, letting me know she trusted me with this fragile closeness. Finally, she exhaled and withdrew her hand slowly, placing it in her lap, but her smile remained, warm, private, and knowing. I felt an urge to speak, to say something that might define the tension between us, but I realized words weren't necessary. The space we shared, the touches, the lingering glances, and the silent acknowledgement were enough. That afternoon, everything changed. The physical closeness, so careful and measured, was no longer accidental. It was deliberate, a gentle step forward, a quiet exploration of the bond that had been building between us. We were discovering how to be near each other without words, how to communicate with touch, with breath, with the subtle language of presence. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the floor, I felt a warmth that wasn't just from the sunlight. It was from her, from the recognition that the distance between us had shrunk again, replaced by something richer, deeper, and profoundly human. And for the first time, I allowed myself to hope, quietly, tenderly, that this delicate closeness might not fade. The weeks that followed felt lighter, though no one outside our home could have understood why. We didn't rush, we didn't speak of labels or definitions. Instead, we found comfort in the quiet moments, the deliberate closeness, the small gestures that carried meaning deeper than words ever could. One evening, after dinner, she suggested we sit on the porch. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of night-blooming jasmine and the lingering warmth of a late summer sun. We brought out 2 cups of tea and settled into the chairs side by side, close enough that the edges of our blankets touched. At first, we didn't speak, letting the soft chorus of crickets fill the space. The rhythm of the night felt intimate, private, as if the world itself had softened around us. Slowly, without planning it, she leaned lightly against my shoulder. The weight was gentle, unassuming, yet it sent a thrill through me, a quiet acknowledgement of the trust and comfort that had grown between us. I rested my arm behind her, letting my hand fall naturally near hers. The brush of her fingers against mine was enough to send warmth through me, a reminder that this closeness wasn't fleeting or accidental. She shifted slightly, tilting her head just enough that I could feel her hair brushing my cheek, and I exhaled softly, realizing how much I had come to cherish these moments. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and intimate, a whisper meant only for me. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. "Of being seen. Of being like this." Her hand found mine, and we intertwined fingers naturally, without hesitation, as if this simple act had always been meant to happen. I turned slightly, letting my head rest near hers. "I see you," I murmured. "Truly. And I always will." The words were simple, but they carried everything I felt, the admiration, the tenderness, the quiet longing that had grown over months of subtle moments and shared silences. We sat like that for a long time, speaking little, existing in a shared intimacy that felt both fragile and enduring. The night deepened around us, and with every passing minute, the sense of distance that had once defined our relationship faded. What remained was warmth, trust, and a quiet affection that didn't need to be defined to be real. At one point, she laughed softly at something I said, a sound that made the night feel lighter, sweeter. I realized then that we had reached a place neither of us had dared to imagine, a balance between respect, closeness, and unspoken desire. The kind of bond that was steady, tender, and fully human. As the moon rose higher, casting silver light across the porch, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. This was not a fleeting connection, nor a secret to be hidden. It was a gentle, enduring closeness, a slow-burn love that had grown naturally, with patience and care, nurtured by shared moments and heartfelt honesty. And in that serene, starlit silence, with her leaning lightly against me and our fingers intertwined, I knew that our story had reached a beautiful, satisfying resolution. We were together, in the quietest, most profound way possible, and it felt like home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share. And if you want more slow-burn romances and emotional stories, subscribe and hit the bell. There's so much more waiting to unfold.